Good afternoon. Glad you could all make it. I think this should be quite an exciting afternoon for us. Our two speakers, I don't think they need introduction, but I'll do it anyway because that's what I'm supposed to do. Myron Orfield, professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, and non-resident senior fellow. The Brookings Institution in Washington, affiliated to members of the UNH Country School of Public Affairs. He's one of the foremost the country's foremost experts on metropolitan government. He's a frequent commentator and writer in various journals, the U.S. News and World Report, Wall Street Journal. If anyone read the paper on Sunday, will see his name was prominently in the paper. Myron O'Toole is a fellow at the Cato Institute and the author of many books. Before working at the Cato Institute, he taught environmental economics at Yale, UC Berkeley, and Utah State University. Here's how we will try to keep peace in the program today. Randal will go first. He'll have 20 minutes or so, followed up by Myron, who will speak for 20 minutes, and then they will have a debate if there's anything they disagree on. Join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, Mr. Orfield and Mr. O'Toole.
Well, we flipped a coin, and I get to go first. This is indeed the first time we've met, and as near as I can tell, Mr. Orfield's a very nice man. I hope he thinks I'm a nice man, but nice people sometimes disagree. I look at urban areas and I see complexity. As J.B.S. Haldane, to paraphrase J.B.S. Haldane, urban areas are not only more complicated than we understand, they're more complicated than we can understand. Now, Herman Daly, who's something of a guru in sustainability planning, wrote a book called Steady State Economics, and he said the solution to complexity is to simplify reality. We can't build models enough that are complex enough to deal with it, so you simplify reality. And that's what urban planning has been all about for the last 80 years. Starting with this man, a Swiss architect who styled himself Le Corbusier and who's been called the Rasputin of urban planning. He said everybody should live in high-rise houses. So after World War II, all over the world, governments started building high-rises everywhere. And he thought everybody should live in high-rises. And in the late 1950s, an architectural critic named Jane Jacobs was upset that they wanted to tear down her neighborhood in New York City and turn it into high-rises. So in 1961, a book came out called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in which she said two things. First, urban planners don't understand how cities work. And she was absolutely right about that. Many of the high-rises built in the United States have been since imploded because they proved totally unlivable. In Eastern Europe, high-rises have been destroyed because people, as soon as they won their freedom, went out and bought single-family homes. In Western Europe, many of the high-rises today are occupied mainly by low-income immigrants because the residents don't want to live in those areas. Now, Jane Jacobs' second message was, I, Jane Jacobs, do know how cities work. She lived in Greenwich Village. And so when she described how cities work, she described Greenwich Village. 4- and 5-story buildings of upper floors of apartments and ground floor shops. And urban planners read this book and they said, yes, we were wrong, she's right. And so they started a new branch of urban planning called the New Urbanism, dedicated to turning cities all across the country into Greenwich Village. And not just cities, but suburbs as well. All development should be built or rebuilt as Greenwich villages. This is the credo of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And so we're seeing these 5-story buildings popping up. This is in Denver, this is in Minneapolis, this is in Portland. And the odd thing is, before about 1990, nobody built 5-story buildings because if you built more than 3 stories, you had to have an elevator, and if you had an elevator, it didn't pay off unless you had at least 6 stories. So these 5-story buildings are extremely rare, they're unmarketable, so inevitably they have to be heavily subsidized. So most of them receive some form of subsidy. Now, why is it so important to pack people into these 5-story buildings? Well, urban planners started saying, well, we have to protect our farmlands and our forests and open space. Well, we pointed out all the urban areas in America only add up to 3% of the land area of the country. More than half the country is farmland, and we use only 30% of it for growing crops. And in fact, our crop yields are growing faster than our population, so we need even less and less of it every year. In Minnesota, only 2% of the land is urbanized. So then they said, well, we need to save energy. Well, guess what? It turns out single-family homes use less energy per square foot than multifamily, especially mid-rise and high-rise. And so if you want to save energy, it's better to build single-family homes. Multifamily only saves energy because the houses are smaller. The dwelling units are smaller. But if you really want to save energy, build what are called zero-energy homes. This is a zero-energy home that actually produces as much energy as it consumes. So then they said, well, we need to get people in more compact development so that we can reduce driving, because people will drive less if it's denser. I consider this to be a form of cargo cult. If we redesign our cities to look the way they did before we had cars, people will stop driving. Well, as soon as those people had cars, they started driving, so it didn't work then and it won't work now. Actually, an economist at the University of California, Irvine, was hired by a federal agency to do a literature review, and he found there is a link between density and land use and transportation, but it's too small to be useful in trying to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce driving. Portland, my former hometown, in 1980, 9.9% of all commuters took transit to work. The city increased the region increased the population density by 20%. They built 5 light rail lines. They built lots and lots of these 5-story high-density developments at a subsidy of $1.2 billion. Today, thanks to all this development and redevelopment, the percentage of commuters taking transit to work is all the way up to 7.4%, a 25% decline. San Francisco Bay Area. Since 1980, they've increased their population densities by 65%. They built 200 miles of rail transit. Again, dozens and dozens of 5-story, multifamily mixed-use developments. Per capita transit ridership has declined by 1/3. Per capita driving has increased by 5 to 10%. If you want to save energy through transportation, get something like this. This is a Volvo diesel-electric plug-in hybrid. It gives 60 miles per gallon. You can use diesel fuel, which means you can use biodiesel, which means you're producing zero net greenhouse gas emissions. Building light rail to get people out of their cars is an extremely expensive and foolish way of trying to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, next the planners said, well, we have to have affordable housing for people, and multifamily is more affordable. Well, it turns out the reason why housing is unaffordable is because we have planners tinkering with our land markets and making housing expensive. So in places where we don't have a lot of planning, like Indianapolis and Houston, housing is very affordable. Where we do have a lot of planning, like Portland and Minneapolis and the San Francisco Bay Area, housing is very unaffordable. It also turns out that multifamily housing costs more per square foot than single family, especially 4 to 5-story or taller buildings. And so again, the only reason that multifamily is more affordable is because the units are smaller. We're giving people less quantity and lower quality, less privacy, and the people who are opposed to it are often accused of being racist. But how racist is it to say that, well, you know, those minorities, they're used to living in multifamily housing, so we should build more of it for them. That's actually what they wrote in San Francisco. As far as equity goes, we can know how the Twin Cities Transportation or Metropolitan Council feels about equity for low-income people. They recently announced a transit equity plan. They talked all about how low-income people needed to have access to jobs and how it was important to provide them transit so that they'd have this access to jobs. You read the press release, you get to the very end, and it said, here are the 2 parts of our transit equity plan. We're going to build 75 bus shelters in low-income minority neighborhoods, and we're going to spend $1.7 billion building a light rail line to the wealthiest suburb of Minneapolis. That light rail line is projected to carry so few new commuters, get so few commuters out of their car, it would be cheaper to give every single commuter who formerly drove to work, who now takes a light rail, a new Tesla Model S, every other year for the next 30 years than to build the Southwest Light Rail line. So that's our idea of transit equity. It's bus shelters for the poor and Tesla Model S's for the rich. That's equity. Now, the black swan has become known as a term for an event in the future that's so unpredictable that it makes planning very difficult, if not impossible. We have a black swan in the future of urban areas. We know what it is, but we don't know what it's going to do. That black swan is driverless cars, self-driving cars. This is a Google self-driving car. It has no steering wheel, has no accelerator or brake pedals. Anybody can drive it. You can be 9 years old, 90 years old. This gentleman is blind. They're testing it in California. They have 100 of them they're testing. They've driven other self-driving cars 700,000 miles in the United States. What is this going to do to urban planning? If you have a self-driving car, you can spend 2 hours to commute to work and be productive the whole time. Or you can play with your kids, or you can watch movies or read books. That's going to change the way we look at transportation completely. If I have a self-driving car, I'm going to send my dogs to the vet in the car and not go, right? But is this going to lead to more driving or less? Is this going to lead to people moving out into the exurbs, or is it going to end congestion and lead more people to live in the downtown areas? Nobody knows. And so not a single regional plan written in the United States has attempted to assess the impact of self-driving cars, and I haven't even found one that has even mentioned self-driving cars. They're planning for the past. They're planning streetcars from the 1880s. They're planning light rail from the 1930s. They're planning Greenwich villages, which were built in the 1890s. They're not planning for today. They're not planning for the future. What should be done instead? Well, I like Houston. Houston has no zoning. Counties in Texas aren't allowed to zone. That might be a bit radical for you, so I would like you to turn your attention to Indianapolis as an alternative. Indianapolis does have zoning. The urban cities are very proud of the growth here, and yet Indianapolis has historically, for decades, been growing twice as fast as the Twin Cities. Columbus also growing almost twice as fast as the Twin Cities. Columbus also hasn't been tinkering with land markets, hasn't been building extensive rail transit. So my message is that urban planners and land use regulators don't understand how cities work, so they try to oversimplify, they try to follow fads rather than really figure out what people want, and they end up doing far more harm than good. They do harm to housing markets, they do harm to commercial markets, they do harm to transportation systems, and the people of the urban areas that they inflict themselves on end up suffering. Urban planning is the Ebola virus of American urban cities. So maybe Myron agrees with that, maybe he doesn't, but